Welcome back to Truth to Power podcast. I am your host, Danger Varos. As always, today I have a very special guest, an author, investigative science journalist, an all-around cool guy, Justin Nobel. Did I say your last name right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you for having me here, Danger.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. I know that Mariel is super pleased to have you in town, and you're doing these series of community conversations or book talks, or I'm not sure how you would phrase exactly what's happening, but it feels like community conversation is going to be happening.
Yeah, I'm a really big believer in bringing the material back into the real world. Social media is very hard for me, and so I like to take the book, take the articles that I write as I can, if I can, back to communities, present them. It's a very old school way of getting the information out. And yeah, it's a book event, but it's also a community meeting and a chance for people to ask questions, connect, meet maybe other people in their community who feel the same way about issues and learn about this really complicated and important topic.
It is complicated. We've had a hard time getting our heads around it over the last couple of episodes. We've spoken to water experts and organizers, and one thing is for sure, the issue of fracking waste reuse is extraordinarily complicated, and I think the complexity of it allows for some things to fall through the cracks and some details to get lost. And so we appreciate you coming to talk about your work, and people listening now, it'll be too late for you to attend these events because the first one was last night in Taos, and tonight we're in Santa Fe at Collective Works, and tomorrow at the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice, talking about your book, Petroleum 238.
Yeah, I can get right into so you talk about the complexity, and the complex is fine to use that word, but I also don't want people to, because sometimes when they hear, oh, this is going to be complicated, they immediately go to sleep. They're like, it's not for me. That's not true. A child, kindergartner, could understand this issue and know that everything the state is trying to do right now is disastrous. Injecting waste underground, injection wells, disaster. Trying to treat the waste, disaster. It's really, while it is complex, it actually is not that complicated. And I want to start with trying to disarm the topic. So it starts with language, right? As a writer, your tools, or as a comedian, your base tool is a word. That's like what we build our skit off, our act, our stories start with words. And the industry has been very clever and deceptive with words. So they call this waste stream brine, which makes you think of like a holiday meal, like something maybe a little bit salty but not that toxic.
Right, isn't that how you make pickles?
Yeah, right. You have food things come to mind, not radioactive waste. And they also refer to it as produced water, and that is a kind of jargony word that just makes you fall asleep. Sometimes they call it salt water, and sometimes the industry just calls it water. But what this material really is, for one, is it's an absolutely copious waste stream. So if you imagine an oil and gas well, and you picture, the fuels that come to the surface, natural gas, which still cooks it's used in many home stoves, that little blue flame we all know, and you imagine gasoline, so oil, once it's refined, gasoline still runs many cars. You think of the fuels, a lot of people think of climate change emissions now, carbon dioxide, methane, but there's a lot more coming to the surface at a well. There's a huge amount of waste that the industry produces, and brine, or produced water, let's just call it brine, is one of the industry's primary waste streams. Many wells produce more brine than they do oil or gas. And just to give you an idea of how much across the country, about 3 billion gallons of brine a day is generated in the U.S. oil and gas industry. That's 1 trillion gallons a year. If you took that waste stream and put it into your standard oil barrel, which is like waist high, you stack the barrels atop one another, they would reach the moon and back almost 28 times. Wow. So it's just a massive waste stream. The industry has never had a good idea on what to do with it all. In the early days, they just discharged it to unlined pits, to creeks, to streams, to farmland, and it caused an extraordinary amount of contamination. The salt alone in brine can be quite toxic. This is really biblical. If you the worst thing you can do to someone's land, right, is you salt it. You salt someone's land, you destroy its ability to produce
like
crops.
Rome did to Carthage when they were...
Yeah.
And nothing will grow here for 1,000 years.
Yes, right. It's like a hex. And this is what happens when you spill produced water on land. So right away, we're dealing with the toxic element, and we're just focused on salt, which is one of the least toxic things in produced water, but there's so much of it, it can be a real problem. You also have elevated levels of heavy metals, like lead and arsenic, and you have elevated levels of radium, which is this really interesting and worrisome radioactive heavy metal that is a bone seeker, and that's a medical term. That means if accidentally inhaled or ingested, some of the radium will end up in your bones, which is a terrible place for a radioactive element to be. Now you might think, well, how's radium going to get into your bones? Well, a number of ways. Radium is moderately soluble, so it can float with water. It's there in the produced water. There's interesting cases of industrial contamination going across history. There's the case of the radium girls. There was this radioactive paint in the early 1900s. It did cool stuff. Radium made the paint glow, and so women were using it to paint the hands and dials of watches and clocks. And they were using these tiny little brushes that got dried out, and so they would put the tips in their mouth to keep them firm, and accidentally ingested significant amounts of radium. It went to their bones, and many of them died of terrible bone cancers. That's one way radium gets inside of you. Another way is with dust, and this would be the concern for workers at the produced water treatment plants, the exact type that the state of New Mexico is so excited about and proposing or inspiring with this new proposed legislation. So what's happening is you have these materials in the produced water, right? Lead, arsenic, radium. And just before we get to the next step, let's just focus on amounts, right? Because of cases like the radium girls, EPA is actually really worried about this radioactive element. We know it can kill you in a really nasty way. I mean, you can look up photos of the radium girls. They died of terribly painful bone cancers. Radium is a really radioactive and dangerous radioactive element, and EPA has a limit for drinking water. 5 picocuries per liter is the drinking water limit for radium. At 60 picocuries per liter, EPA actually defines a liquid waste stream as radioactive. So you don't have to go that much above the drinking water limit to get to, technically, quote, radioactive waste. Now, brine in the Marcellus Formation back east in Pennsylvania, the state has found, and these are state figures, that radium levels in Marcellus brine can average 9,330 picocuries per liter. So remember, 5 is drinking water limit, 60, it's technically radioactive waste, and we're up above 9,000.
Wow.
Now, amazingly, we don't have a lot of data on New Mexico brine or produced water, but we have some, and it's well above 60. It's in the range of like 600 to 1,200 picocuries per liter. So still, many times above this limit at which EPA defines radioactive waste. So right away, we just disintegrate this industry idea. It's just salt water. It's just brine. No. It's radioactive waste. That's what it is. Despite going into trucks that are unmarked, despite workers not knowing, by the laws of the science that the regulatory agencies have crafted themselves, it's radioactive waste. And where that comes into a problem with treatment is what they're trying to do is remove the bad stuff from the brine so it can be reused. And this, again, is why I say, children could answer this question. If you have this cup of bad stuff and you want to get the bad stuff out and you kind of have like endless cup after cup of it, what are you doing? Well, you're concentrating that bad stuff. So even if you can successfully treat produced water, which is a massive challenge because of the salts, because of the heavy metals, it's a really difficult material to work with. And the facilities I visited back east, many of them, they fail. They could have $250 million investments, which some of them have. They still fail. But even if you are successful at, quote, treating produced water, you have inherently removed, concentrated all the radium, and now you actually have an even bigger disposal problem on your hand, because what are you going to do with all this concentrated radium?
Right.
The industry's never been able to answer that. And what my reporting and what the book lays out is that typically what happens is a radiological disaster zone for the community and also, and foremost, for the industry's own workers who are working at these plants.
Wow. That is a lot of radiation, talking about even just the 1500 to 600 range. That's extraordinarily radioactive. I know why you call it the industry's deadly secret, because a lot of people have no idea about this. The produced water issue, or the fracking waste issue in the state, is starting to gain momentum as they're pushing these rule changes and pushing the strategic water supply here. But the radioactivity of this waste has not been a part of the conversation. As a matter of fact, they're holding these Chevron-sponsored symposiums.
Where?
They're in the state of New Mexico. It's like a fake community meeting where they have representatives and people come out and talk about their plans and talk about water rights and acequias, and really it's about trying to sell this reuse of produced water. And at one of these meetings, there's an individual who works for Chevron, and we were having a conversation about produced water, and I mentioned, it was like, well, yeah, Justin Nobel's coming, and he's going to give these talks about radiology and produced water, and which of course it's radioactive. And he was like, I don't know anything about that. And
I'd love to talk to this individual. These people should be called out and put in the public square and made to answer questions. And I challenge them all the time. Chevron would be great. Bring your top 3 scientists. I'll bring my top 3 experts, and we'll have a debate on this. I offer that challenge to them any day.
What was really shocking is a few weeks ago, the Legislative Finance Committee did a tour down south of oil fields and methane discharges. And while I was down there, I was really curious about produced water and fracking. And so I took my own little trip between Loving, New Mexico, and Jal, which is all the way at the bottom, across the Permian Basin. Yeah. No infrastructure, no buildings, no gas stations, but there were hundreds upon hundreds of water trucks, unmarked water trucks, and they are just carrying it back and forth all over the place. Big pools on the side of the road, open air storage outside. Right. It's everywhere.
Yeah. So it is everywhere. And what I want to do when I come back to New Mexico, hopefully later this year, is do a tour of the produced water treatment facilities. I'll lay out now what I found in the Marcellus, which is harrowing. And I do think a version of that is happening in New Mexico, but I can't confirm it until I spend a little bit more time in communities. I actually know the mayor of Jal and the city administrator, and it's a great community. And city officials there are they may be for oil and gas, which many of them are. It's important income and work for members of the community, but they are not for oil field waste. And there's a little bit of a disconnect. They don't like injection wells, for example, in Jal. Right. Injection wells are where much of the trucks you saw, they're going to injection wells to inject this waste below the ground. As the book I'm about to talk about at Collected Works lays out, there is no scientific merit behind this idea that you can inject endless truckloads of fracking waste under the earth. Now, industry, and it causes earthquakes, by the way, they leak, and there's all sorts of hazards. And also, even conservative communities in oil and gas country hate injection wells. They don't like this idea, and this is where we can go back to, ask a room full of kids about injecting toxic waste below the earth. It's just intuitively, it doesn't make sense. Well, it turns out scientifically, it actually makes no sense either. And industry is trying to pivot away from injection wells, and this is why you have something like the proposed legislation on produced water treatment. They see that as the pathway past injection wells. It's a way to, quote, green the industry. It's a win-win. We get rid of injection wells, we clean up the produced water, we give water to farmers, and heck, we can even make lithium now out of the produced water. Right. It's all pie in the sky bullshit. until they can prove that it's not, but I've never seen it. So what I've seen is facilities in West Virginia. They come online with a lot of gusto, produced water treatment. I'm thinking of one particular one called Clearwater. Clearwater was a project of Antero, which is a very large Colorado-based oil and gas extraction company, and Veolia, which is a multinational billion-dollar-a-year firm with headquarters in Paris, France. And they were going to treat produced water, take hundreds of trucks a day, get the trucks off the road, get rid of injection wells, and they even talked about making a food-grade quality salt with the salts they were going to pull from the produced water. Yeah, they were going to call it Taste of the Marcellus. This is there's a community meeting where one of their engineers says this.
Oh my God.
Yeah, imagine that, Taste of the Permian. But they said these things, and the community, to the credit, were very well informed in West Virginia, asked questions. Well, what are you going to do with the radioactivity? What's going to happen? Won't that concentrate it if you remove it? The engineer they couldn't answer those questions. And the facility, it turns out, couldn't answer them either, because less than 2 years later, this facility, which was $255 million, and they also had this amazing quote, this is going to be the best thing for the environments in like the past 3 generations of the oil and gas industry, bar none, period. I mean, they really talked this facility up. Well, it shuttered. And they told the press it shuttered because gas prices fluctuated. But what I eventually found out is that it failed because it could not appropriately process this material. It got gunked up, as I've learned that they all do. And when I say gunked up, I mean it's a really complicated waste stream, brine, despite the easy name, and it's really difficult to move it through a lot of different tanks and tubes and equipment. Things break down constantly. They don't know how to deal with it. The engineers haven't designed these projects appropriately, and so what you literally end up with is radioactive waste piled, stashed, spilled all over these facilities. Now, Clearwater, I can't say exactly what happened on site because I haven't been allowed on site to visit that facility. I am in touch with workers who described some really concerning things. But we can now move to another facility not far from Clearwater called Fairmont Brine Processing. So this is the same thing New Mexico is proposing. Treat the brine, process the brine. Fairmont Brine, again, they had connections to universities in Pennsylvania. They thought this was going to be a great thing. They told the workers they were greening the industry. And what happened there is the plant could not deal with this waste stream, and so you had this weird sludge and sediment like piling up in bins around the facility. It too shuttered eventually, and I visited it after it was abandoned with a former Department of Energy scientist, and we just found the entire place was splattered with radioactive waste. There were these moats where brine was still sitting there in pits. There was a huge pond filled with radioactive wastewater. Now, the worst part of it was it had become a community party spot. So kids were literally partying in radioactive waste. Yeah, there are beer cans, used condoms, like a nasty soiled mattress floating in a moat of radioactive water. It was just atrocious. And, it's a weird abandoned site, so I could see how kids would hang out there. It's like way up on this hill above the city. It's a cool little hang, except it's completely radioactive. And then later I was connected to the workers at that plant, and that's a different story. They received the most significant exposures. They were working in this dusty environment. And now we go back to the story of the Radium Girls, because these guys were breathing in this dust like 12 hours a day. Sometimes it's a 16-hour shift, and they're back there again 12 hours a day, breathing in and breathing in. It's absolutely the worst way to take radioactivity, is to breathe it in that way, because you're taking these radioactive elements into the core part of your body where there's no protection against the radiation that they will eventually give
and
off.
I suppose your bloodstream will then deposit it throughout your body, concentrating in your lungs, or
all sorts of interesting and little studied things happen. The science is still amazingly trying to wrap its mind around exactly what happens when different radioactive elements come into the body, but they move about in different ways. So yes, some get stuck in the lungs, some go to the bones, and as they decay and become other radioactive elements, just like you said, the bloodstream can carry them, our digestive tracts can carry them, down, and so there's a variety of different organs and body systems that become at risk. But you don't want it inside you, and that's exactly what happens when you breathe in dust, which is just what these workers were doing.
So would you consider your work to be ongoing, or do you think that have you gotten to some sort of a conclusion that you now present the findings of, or are you still uncovering things on this?
Yeah, I mean, I realize that there are really important ramifications from the work. So the book is a pretty solid wrap-up of this topic, and it's laid out in a way that I think is really accessible. I follow the pathway of literary journalism, so it's not just like a dry report, and dry reports are fine. I mean, that's what a lot of really great environmental groups put out, and that's the building blocks of knowledge on a lot of these complex issues. But this is weaving information in with human stories, and so it's a book that I think people who are they're part of a book club, and they usually read true crime and they just love a great story. They're going to like this too, because this is crazy. I mean, what they're going to read may seem like fiction, and I think it's a book that can be accessible to people who just don't even care about the environment, although it's hard to imagine. But yeah, there are people who want to read other things. I get it. They don't want to read an environmental downer. But the book is also very much a toolkit. It's a toolkit for those who are trying to hold this industry accountable. It's a toolkit for policymakers, for public health advocates, and for all the different groups working in this space. There's quite a lot of information there. But to answer the other part of your question, yeah, I still am reporting. So, for example, what I learned is that anywhere they are trying to treat produced water is a potential radiological disaster zone, and that's a place to investigate as a journalist. Now, while I've been able to do that in the Marcellus, which is the formation that up in the Northeast and Appalachia, I haven't been able to on the ground do that in New Mexico. So in that regard, the investigation still does continue. I think there's going to be problems, but I can't tell you for sure until I've spent enough time in communities to connect with workers. And that's really always the thing that takes us over the edge, takes my reporting over the edge. I can do file reviews and get copies of inspections, and maybe the state's found sketchy things, but it hasn't all been made public. But it's until the workers convey what's happening, that's when we really get to learn just how sloppy the industry is. And typically it's much worse. It's much worse than a state inspection report would convey. The nuance and details of the schemes are almost impossible to conceive until you really hear about them. Such as in Ohio, I found a scheme where the industry was actually using men recently released from prison and often with drug problems. So they're in this desperate state, they're out of prison, and this is, of course, a group you want to help re-enter society, and yet they were given jobs at facilities shoveling and scooping around oil-filled waste that happened to be really radioactive, far more radioactive than the brine, because it's the sludge, it's the accumulation of all the really nasty stuff in the brine. It forms on the bottom of tanks. It's way too radioactive to take to local landfills, and so the industry has come up with this horrendous job called downblending, where they're trying to mix this radioactive oil-filled sludge with non-radioactive items like lime, coal ash, ground up corn cobs, and these workers just released from prison, desperate for work, and using drugs in the workplace. And I mean hard drugs, smoking pot, selling acid, and smoking crack while mixing around radioactive oil-filled waste with no protection. It's utterly outrageous. But that was a scheme. Wow. And I couldn't even have conceived that until, you think it's bad, and then you find that, and you're like, oh, it goes beyond.
Yeah, we have a problem in New Mexico with it being somewhat of a neo-colonial place. This other place that's sparsely populated and really mixed, and so we have these problems we have uranium mine leaks, and we had the atomic bomb which was tested here several times, and things like this produced water thing. But it sounds like you're talking about these workers, these former prisoners, as being just sacrificial fodder for the industry, just because they don't care, and that's kind of frightening.
Yeah, I mean, imagine what it would cost. You can pay these dudes $15 an hour, and they lap it up. They're so excited just to have a job. Imagine what it would cost if they had to be trained. They have to have formal, radiation gear. they're skilled, and skilled means you have to pay them more. You're talking about paying them like maybe $40, $50 an hour. I mean, that alone, the industry makes, whether they're public or not, these are the types of calculations. So of course they're always going to go, if they can, with just, with the lesser thing. And that's the problem. The lesser thing means, like these guys are at risk of developing cancer down the line. It doesn't just mean like that sloppy job. It's a serious thing, and the hazards are real. But
it sounds like even if they were trained, properly outfitted workers at a produced water treatment facility, there would still be an enormous risk to them, and there would still be this insanely hazardous byproduct.
Yeah, right. No, they, even if done in the and that's the thing. I want to say even if done in the best way, but the industry hasn't proved that they even, quote, have a best way. So that's part of the problem here. And when I hear the governor of New Mexico talk about produced water treatment, it's clear that the governor has no idea, absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Some people in the legislature, if they spend time in the oil field, may. I was coming this way actually from Paonia, a really cool town in Colorado, and this bridge is out by Gunnison. So there's this hold up while they wait for a detour, and the person behind me, it was an RV, and we live in an RV back in New York. So I'm immediately talking to this guy. He's an older gentleman. He's going to like a blues, weekend thing, and that was cool. And it turns out he works in the oil field. So we start talking, and I told him, I report on the oil field, and he's like, "Is it a hit piece you do?" I'm like, "Well, no, it's, we got into talking about oil field waste. It turns out he hauled produced water. He ran an oil field service company, and he hauled." I was like, "Oh, like hauling produced water?" Yeah, that's exactly what he did. He had no idea about radium, about these issues. It's a job. The industry needs to get rid of this stuff. And we live in this entrepreneurial country where you can start a business. I mean, that's what America was made for. Like, there's a niche, there's a room, there's a job to have, and someone starts a company and does it. And they may not even know that they're hauling radioactive waste or what they're doing is dangerous, but they're, making money, and they think they're doing well helping the industry solve this problem. So
yeah, I'm glad you brought up the industry side of it, because that's kind of the key that the oil and gas industry is trying to use. They want to have these pilot projects so that private companies can test and attempt to reuse, and they have this laundry list of possible reuses. And I was curious, in all your investigations and all your work, what have you seen in places where produced water is being reused? What have you seen it being reused for?
First, I want to give a call out to, because I hope, Danger, your podcast goes far and wide. So if you are a worker in New Mexico, and maybe you're working at a plant you love and everything is fine, a produced water treatment plant, but if you're working at a plant that seems sketchy, that you feel like you're not being appropriately informed, and maybe even you feel like there's always been something wrong, but you can never put your finger on it, which is what I hear from a lot of workers in the East, then I mean, reach out, because I want to visit these facilities, and I want to be able to really understand what's happening in New Mexico. And again, often there are workers who are really worried, and they, as odd as it seems, they have maybe tried to reach out to the state agencies, just like we do, and they're not getting a response. So I think it's talking about this issue provides a good olive branch to the workers who are worried. Not all of them are loving this job. They might just have taken this job because some other, maybe they were farming, and it's harder to, be a farmer now with so many goods coming from overseas. Maybe they were into some other industry, and that job got nixed, and so now they took a job driving a brine truck or shoveling sludge out of a brine tank, and they always thought it was a little bit sketchy. And now, here's a chance to help share what you've been up against. But what has it been used for? In the Northeast, in the Midwest, where winters are cold, and in rural areas where there's a lot of dirt roads, the industry has convinced townships that it's really a great idea to put oil field brine down on roads to help melt snow and ice, or on dusty roads to keep dust down. Now this is this is a really interesting sham that the industry has been able to get away with. In rural areas, in rural communities, in northern states, snow and ice removal and roads in general are one of the biggest costs that you have to pay for. Your public works department in dealing with roads can often be one of the biggest costs. So here comes an industry saying, oh, this thing that you have to pay a lot of money for, we're going to give you this stuff for free, and it does the same job. That's really attractive, and that's dangerous, though, if you don't know what's in that material. But that's exactly what's happened with oil-filled brine. And despite us now knowing that there's radium in it, and that radium is a carcinogen, and for God's sakes, why would you want to put more of it right in contact with humans? It's a terrible idea. But you're going up now against what's become part of the culture, and that's the issue with a lot of the problems that the book exposes. Like in Oklahoma, they spread drilling waste on pasture land. It's absolutely deranged, but talk to people who do this practice, as I did, and they're convinced that cows love drilling waste and that cows will forage more enthusiastically in areas where there's drilling waste. Now, there's no science to support that, but they're convinced of it in Oklahoma.
Somebody had to have told them that was true.
Yeah, and that story is laid out in the book.
I know that we, some potential uses that I've heard in New Mexico were to grow hemp with it. And I also heard somebody say, like, no, it'll be okay because we'll grow it in these above-ground containers. And it's like, well, is it safe or not? Like, they want to make hydrogen out of it really bad. I know there's a big push, especially in the governor's office, to create a hydrogen industry here. And they call it green hydrogen, but I'm not sure how green it could be if 98% of it is made from this radioactive, toxic fracking waste. And then there's agriculture. But obviously, if you're talking about this radium, we're talking about bioaccumulation into the environment,
Absolutely.
We already have problems in this country with PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkylates, and forever chemicals ending up in people's milk and eggs. And this would cause a similar disaster, you're saying?
There may be a way to treat produced water. And in some states, there are less heavy metals, less salts, less radioactive metals. Wyoming, for example, levels of metals and levels of radium are much lower. And they do use produced water in agriculture. I haven't spent enough time in Wyoming to know whether they're appropriately doing that or not, but I know that the levels are less, and it would be easier to deal with produced water when the levels are lower. New Mexico, Permian, the levels are not as high as the Marcellus, but they're reasonably high, and so it's a major concern. And also, by the way, I'm saying that with a very little data. We don't even know what a lot of the Permian is like. Levels in produced water, and when I say levels, I mean levels of radium, radioactive metal, levels of heavy metals. It varies by across a formation and even within the same well. So it is really disingenuous for the state to say it's fine, and they haven't even fully canvassed and sampled produced water and told us what's in it in all the different parts of the state where they want to do this. So that's the first alarm bell. And the second is right. As you mentioned, you have this conundrum. If they remove the stuff, well, they've got a problem at the treatment facilities. If they don't remove it, well, then you're spraying heavy metals and radioactivity, onto crops, and that is going to bioaccumulate. We have a lot of lessons from that in other periods of U.S. history, and the industry has not really ever been pushed to create a treatment that is really sophisticated. And part of the reason is because oil-filled waste is considered non-hazardous. So you get these, again, we go back to this cowboy entrepreneurial spirit. It should be a complex system run by people with really, really sophisticated training, and yet when you visit a produced water treatment plant, the vibe is kind of like a bunch of dudes at a bar got messed up and are like, hey, we should get into this because there's some money in it. And it's really like, that's what it feels like. It's like quick bang money, and like, yeah, we can figure this thing out, and typically they can't. And so that'd be my concern in New Mexico. Who's going to be running these facilities? What training do they have? Do they know about any of this stuff? And I know enough to know that often the answer is no. Right.
The solution is to let the industry handle it. Let capitalist incentives and let people's desire to make a quick buck handle the mess for them. But it doesn't seem like it's going to be that easy. I'm almost hearing that if the industry and the state were being more responsible about this, that they would have a bit more of a tailored approach where they might have some data about the water and the levels in the water and be like, hey, it turns out that this particular area has some brine that we might be able to treat, and we might have some, but they're not saying that at all. They just want to, like Ian Malcolm said in Jurassic Park, slap it on a lunchbox and sell it.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and I would love for them, show me a produced water treatment facility in New Mexico that's been up and running, taking truckloads of fracking waste, and again, let's use the scientific terms, taking truckloads of toxic radioactive fracking waste. Show me a facility that's been taking truckload after truckload of toxic radioactive fracking waste, and it's been running for a year. And show me. I want to see your model facility, not the new one when all the equipment is shiny. I want to see the one that's been running for a year. Please call me up. I'll be there. I'll take an electric car, and we'll tour it. I'd love to do that. And there should be a lot of scientists and groups like New Energy Economy on that tour, too, because we need to know what's happening. It doesn't seem like they've offered that up yet.
No, it does seem very haphazard, disingenuous. Speaking of New Energy Economy, you are offering testimony and expertise on this matter. I'm not sure that this is within the purview of your expertise and testimony, but another challenge isn't just the PFAS, it's not just the radium, it's these proprietary chemicals. Is that a common issue that you've seen in your investigative work, that this kind of challenge of trying to quote-unquote treat water when you don't even really know what's in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a lot of the brine haulers, a lot of the workers who work with produced water have told me, they have trucks that carry liquids. Produced water is a liquid filled with all sorts of toxic elements, as we've been discussing. But when they're up at the wellhead, and this is their own words, variety of workers, number of workers told me a version of the exact same quote, which is, we don't just haul produced water, we haul whatever the hell they want off that well pad, which will fit in my truck, right? So for one, we know they're hauling flowback. Flowback is a very different waste stream. You use a variety of different chemicals to frack a well. These chemicals are designed to crack open rocks, make them slippery, enhance fractures, and allow oil and gas to come out of these difficult to access formations. Well, those toxic chemicals, and we often don't know what they are, as you pointed out, they kind of are like upchucked back in this really sloppy way just as a well comes online. And that period is referred to as, or the waste stream that comes up in that period is called flowback. It has some of the metals and radioactivity associated with produced water, but it also has some of these toxic chemicals used. They come back up, right? Inject them down into the earth. Some remain down there. That's a problem. Others come back up. Now, that's very different than the produced water. That is going to be mixed in an unknown way. No one knows what happens when you mix toxic flowback with toxic produced water, and then you inject it back into the earth, and you're injecting, remember, chemicals that are designed to crack open rocks and enhance fractures. That's a problem. Or you're mixing them in tanks in a produced water treatment plant. So you bring up a really good point. The radium is a concern for these workers, but the fracking chemicals are absolutely a concern as well. And workers will often have to be inside a tank, which means they're being intimately exposed to all of this. Workers will have to often, there's a worker, really horrible worker story. He was up to his shins in this waste. It eats through the boots. He had these terrible burns, and then he developed all these rashes and kind of like burning protrusions that went across his body from this one experience of being in this tank of fracking waste. Yeah, he was in the emergency room, in and out, and he was a young guy. He had children, and he passed away just a couple of years ago.
Oh, gosh.
And with never a medical analysis, which is another, really aggravating part of this, is the medical professions, generally speaking, lack of ability to really understand what these workers are facing. But
they're just kind of being swept under the rug and so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned earthquakes, and that is a fact that earthquakes are up by the thousands in the Permian Basin down south. It has had a 4.0 earthquake in Artesia, which was unheard of a few years ago, and now it's commonplace. Oklahoma, other places where they frack are having earthquakes, but they're also having this emerging problem that I'm seeing on TikTok, for example, and that's zombie wells, old plugged oil and gas wells erupting with deep groundwater and brine.
Oh, interesting.
That was, no one really knows exactly where it came from.
Oh, I know exactly what that is.
Probably from injection wells.
Absolutely,
and creating a lot of pressure underground, and they're eating away at the rock, and now they're coming up through these old plugged wells. And there was a TikTok video I saw recently where there was an oil field worker who was at an old plugged well, and it was gushing out and spilling all over this ranch land, and he was just walking through it, and he had no idea what it was really. And I don't think anybody is aware that it's not only highly toxic, but radioactive as hell, so to speak.
Can you send that video to me?
Absolutely,
Because that's... So one thing, and hopefully I have a chance to discuss that tonight, is that injection wells, there's no scientific merit. So yes, they will all be leaking out, and this absolutely sounds like the overload of fracking waste that has been injected underground is coming back to the surface. And as I'll lay out in the talk, this was predicted in the 70s by the industry. They predicted exactly how injection wells would leak. They predicted they would cause earthquakes. But as far as the leaking is concerned, they are going to come back to the surface at places where there already are conduits that connect from the underground to the above ground, such as an oil and gas well. So this makes, just the type you're describing, an old conventional well. So this makes perfect sense. More and more of that is going to happen. Injection wells do not work. They are all leaking, technically. It's only a matter of until they find a conduit back to our part of the earth, which is above ground. But they're all leaking. This is
an important point about them leaking and them being unsafe, because New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, their official position is that there has never been a produced water leak in New Mexico. We have one of the water quality control commissioners who's deciding this produced water reuse rule is in a video on NMOGA's website saying there's never been a leak of produced water ever. Fracking is totally safe. And it seems to me like just the existence of injection wells, again, to go back to your point that a kindergartner could understand this, if you are injecting it into the ground, how can you possibly say it's not leaking? How could you possibly say with any assurity whatsoever that it's not leaking? Because it's almost like by injecting it, you're deliberately leaking it into the ground.
So what's happening there is you create a bulb of waste underground. So this idea that there's a layer that can hold the waste, that there's this kind of underground storage locker, no. There's no underground storage locker. You're injecting into a porous layer, which just means you're injecting into a layer, a geologic formation that happens to have a lot of space, a lot of little holes. So some layers are squished tight and you can't inject anything. Try as hard as you want, nothing's going to go there. There's no storage locker, but you have these layers with a lot of different, tiny holes. We call that pore space. And those are the layers that they choose for injection. Now, a layer with a lot of little holes, little pockets, likely over Earth's history, millions of years, would have already gotten filled up with other things, such as water or such as oil and gas. These are the exact layers oil and gas will collect in as it flows up from other layers deeper within the Earth. So if you're injecting into a layer, and the first thing that happens, and again, this is described in the early 70s in this amazing conference of the industry, is that you're going to be pushing whatever's already in that layer out of the way. So say you're a farmer 3 miles away. You might have a well, and suddenly your well is actually running stronger with fresh water. And you're like, well, look at that. All of a sudden I've got more pressure in my well. Mm-hmm. What's happening is the bulb of waste is pushing the fluid that's already in the zone of injection out of the way. And so it pops up at a stronger rate, and you might think, wow, look, the well's running stronger. This is great. But the waste will eventually reach your well, and suddenly your well will be spouting fracking waste. And that's what's happening at all of these places. And where the fracking waste is reaching is not necessarily water wells, which are located, they typically don't go down as deep, but they're reaching wells that go down very deep, which again are oil and gas wells, old conventional oil and gas wells. So in Ohio, that's what's happening. And this is something I'm going to be reporting on in New Mexico, because clearly it's a major issue. So I'll have to spend some time with that when I'm here next, and I'm just taking notes of that because I think it's a really important topic.
Do you have any reason to believe that the oil and gas industry has been fully aware for quite some time that this brine is highly radioactive?
Oh yeah. They when we say oil and gas industry generally, there's people who have known. The industry, so we can say, yes, the industry has known. Now, does every single executive sitting there overseeing billions of dollars in assets know? Not necessarily, and some of them may have no idea. But that doesn't mean that they're not liable or accountable, because, yes, there's American Petroleum Institute reports which lay this out, crystal clear. I think, because I need to save energy for the talk, so I don't know if I can go much further. And also, we're kind of running
we're great on time
close
too.
Yeah.
Well, I really want to thank you for joining us for this episode. This has been absolutely mind-boggling, and I hope everyone listens to every last drop of this, and that you stay hungry for more information, because we have got to stick together to try to oppose this disaster before it becomes a disaster for our land and our water and our people and our animals. So thank you so much for coming to New Mexico and sharing all of your findings with us, and taking the time to come talk to us on this podcast, Justin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Danger.